Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I am here today to take a first look at the build, the design, some of the changes that have been made to the new Sony a7R Mark III. And of course, this is a camera that I've personally been really excited about taking a look at. I really think that the Sony a7R series has a lot going for it, but there have been some pretty serious flaws on some of Sony's mirrorless bodies to this point. One of the notable ones being, of course, the battery life that is not at all competitive, or has not at all been competitive with DSLRs. And so, of course, that is one significant change that has been made. Beyond that, of course, the autofocus system on the a7R Mark II was, again, really not competitive with comparative DSLRs. And so Sony has really addressed that by bringing, for the most part, the vastly improved autofocus system from the A9 here into the a7R3, which gives it a very fast burst rate of up to 10 frames per second. And on top of that, of course, it has a much faster autofocus, better autofocus tracking, more flexibility in how you're going to program and use that autofocus tracking technology. And of course, on top of that, Sony already has a lot of great proprietary technologies that have already been a standout for them, that they have added to and built upon, including things like the 5-axis in-body image stabilization, which of course is a very, very useful attribute there. It has a very good EVF here that is improved in terms of its resolution. So we're going to jump in and take a closer look here at the build and the design of this camera, and look at a few of the upgrades and maybe even an area or two that still needs upgrading. So let's jump in together and let's take a look at the Sony a7R Mark III. So first of all, let's take a look here at the back, and there are a few improvements here that I want to point out. Number one is just the quality and the feel of some of these dials themselves, which frankly felt a little bit cheap on the a7R3, or a7R2 I should say, particularly when you're comparing them to kind of equivalent DSLRs from Canon or Nikon. And so that certainly is a welcome change, and so just the quality of the feel of the buttons themselves is better. The addition of the thumbstick is, of course, huge, and that's particularly huge for one reason, and that is that for whatever reason, Sony persists in having pretty limited touchscreen functionality on the actual LCD screen. And that really, frankly, is surprising to me. But you can't really affect the menu at all by using the touchscreen. And so that means that you are left using these basic kind of the dial and directional pad, or the thumbstick here. And so the thumbstick, of course, becomes very handy for that. It also becomes handy for things like selecting autofocus points if you're using something like that. There's a variety of functionalities, so that's certainly a nice addition there. And I do wish that Sony would up their game with the touchscreen here. Now, one thing that is nice is that, kind of like the Nikon D850, you have a tilting screen here. It's not as good as, say, the Canon 6D Mark II and the fully articulating screen, but at the same time, having a tilting screen does help. At the very least, it's shooting at high or low shooting positions and helping you in framing there. Now, the problem with a tilting as opposed to an articulating screen is that when you move into a vertical shooting position, all of that functionality becomes pointless. And so the articulating screen allows you to use it in both positions. And of course, with a tilting as opposed to articulating, at no point is this going to move into a position that you can see from the front of the camera. And so if you're wanting to use it for monitoring, that's not going to happen. But at the same time, I'm not going to criticize too much, in that at the current moment, there are no full-frame kind of professional-grade DSLRs amongst the competitors outside of the Canon 6D Mark II that offer that kind of functionality. Now, if you look into the optical viewfinder itself, it has been improved. It is higher resolution now. It is a over 3.6 megapixel viewfinder, so that's up from a lot of them that are around 2, and so certainly more visibility there. Magnification is around 0.78%, and it has 100% viewfinder coverage, so it looks really good. And of course, there's a lot of flexibility for having an electronic viewfinder. I do find right now this time of year I'm shooting out in snowy conditions that are often quite it's very bright, high contrast, and I do still find that an optical viewfinder is a little bit better than an electronic viewfinder in those kinds of conditions. But of course, the trade-off is that it gives me so much more flexibility for when using, for example, manual focus lenses, to be able to magnify the image in there, to be able to put an overlay that helps with a focus. So certainly a plus there. Another improvement here, I do think, is having a dedicated position for the video recording function, and so that retains, no matter what mode you're in, you can instantly go to video recording if you're so inclined. Now here on the bottom is, let's just point out one huge improvement, and that is of course this right here. Moving to the Z series battery means that, I mean, it is so much better than the previous batteries that I really can't even begin to describe it. And so at this point, I'm into 4 days of reviewing the camera at this point. I've taken hundreds of shots. I have shot some 4K video, and the battery is still showing 52%. If this was the a7R2, I can pretty much guarantee you that I would have already had multiple battery charges at this point. And of course, it had to ship with a couple of batteries just so you could really get through much of anything. So a huge improvement there. Another improvement is on this side, where if we open up this slot, we find that there are now 2 card slots, and so very important for those that are just uncomfortable with the risk of potentially losing your work or a client's work due to a memory card failure. It also, of course, gives you more flexibility. And when I have 2 cards, one thing that I personally like to do is to set it up, which I've already done on this a7R3, to where one card records RAW files, the other records JPEGs. And so I have a backup in a sense, but I also have 2 different kind of file formats to choose from. And so I like that a lot. Now, Sony has elected to make one of these cards UHS 2 compliant, and so that certainly is nice because it unlocks some faster read and write speeds. The other slot, however, is stuck on just UHS 1, and so note that it could potentially negatively impact your buffer depending on how you have things set up. And so you're going to want your primary read card, where you're putting the largest files, to be this slot right here that has the UHS 2 support. But obviously that's a big step in the right direction there. Now, in terms of some of the other functionality here, as you can see, top plate is not hugely different here. There is, again, some improvement to the feel of the various dials that are there. Of course, I do like having an exposure value compensation dial right there, and that is one advantage over most DSLRs that do lack that kind of functionality. A lot of times it's got to be accessed through menu options. One thing that I do really want to praise Sony on is the fact that they have thought about having so many buttons that have, the ability to be customized. And so I find that it's easy to kind of, if you'll take the time to set up the camera to where it kind of suits your shooting priorities. And so that helps me a lot in making an ergonomic adjustment to the camera itself. Now, one thing, of course, that is a huge advantage to Sony versus the alternatives is that it does have an extremely effective image stabilization system built right into the body. And I just find that that makes a huge difference. I like the fact that not only can you automatically detect, and according to the specific lens, but you also have the option on Steadyshot to actually adjust it manually according to the focal length that you're using. And I find that in real practical use, as you can see here, it makes a huge difference to do that. For example, if I'm using this 135mm lens, if I have it set up just at kind of a regular setting, the default setting is for a wide angle lens, and so it's not steadying the viewfinder enough. But if I shift it and put in the focal length, all of a sudden everything smooths right out and I get much cleaner footage and better viewfinder stability. So that's a very useful bit of functionality there. And so all in all, of course, the build is improved here, the weather sealing is improved, the quality of the feel of the buttons is improved. Now there's a locking mechanism here for the different modes, and so you're not going to accidentally shift out of that. And of course, beyond this, the heart of all of this is a similar yet improved 42 megapixel sensor, which of course is very, very high resolution. And the advantage now is that there's been some improvement to the readout and a few other tweaks that allow it to have even better performance. It has a native ISO range up to ISO 32,000, and it also allows you to expand on the lower end as well. And so, and upper end for that matter. And so just a lot of improvements there. Of course, at the same time, there was announced this new 24-105 f4G lens. It has optical Steadyshot built into it, and so, of course, that will work in conjunction with the IBIS from the camera body itself, giving you really, really nice stability. And so this lens, which I'll look at a bit more individually, is obviously a really nice pairing if you're looking for a kind of a one lens fits all. The grip is good. However, if you have larger hands, including myself, I think having some kind of battery grip or something added onto here is going to help, just so your whole hand is gripping something without, kind of part of your fingers being orphaned there. But all in all, the grip feels pretty good, and the camera feels stable in my hands. A huge upgrade to this is include much improved buffer and burst rate, and so now we have a burst rate of up to 10 frames per second at full 42.4 megapixels with a buffer of up to 76 frames in RAW. And so obviously that is huge there, and so a lot of different flexibility for that. And that 76 figure seems to be kind of the buffer limit, be it RAW or JPEG. And so that's perhaps curious there, but for most of us, that's plenty to get the job done. The shutter speed is at 1/8,000th of a second, and so you're not limited there compared to DSLRs. In a lot of ways, this camera, because of its improved autofocus system, its incredible burst rate, its very high resolution, incredible sensor, better ergonomics, this is the first mirrorless camera that I have used in terms of its handling and its ergonomics that I would say is a true DSLR replacement. And so to me, that's very high praise. Now, in terms of price, the price point in the US is not cheap. It's at $3,198 coming to market. Of course, that does undercut, an equivalent DSLR, like, for example, my Canon 5D Mark IV. It was more like $3,500. And so it does undercut that in price while offering a lot of technology here and a lot of functionality. One final thing I want to point out before we wrap it up here looking at the build is that another nice thing I think about Sony's that has impressed me a lot, coming from Canon, which is very kind of protectionist about a lot of things. Number one, if I put a third-party lens on a Sony body, unlike on a Canon, Sony actually enables profiles for third-party lenses and fully supports them. So that in itself, of course, is huge. Another huge thing, improvement compared to a Canon, is that a Canon APS-C lens, this is a Sony APS-C lens, but I wouldn't, if this were a Canon lens and a Canon body, I wouldn't be able to use the EFS lens on the EF mount if I were on a Canon, because Canon doesn't allow that. It doesn't have a crop mode, which is something that, of course, Nikon has and Sony has. And so here, if I put this APS-C lens, a great lens, and small and compact, a nice kind of travel companion, this 30 millimeter f1.4 in crop mode, it's a 45 millimeter, and the crop mode is 18 megapixels, and so still plenty of megapixels in terms of resolution for most applications. And of course, you're pairing it with the amazing sensor here and the improved ISO performance, the cleaner looking pixels compared to an APS-C camera, and so that's another huge advantage. And so as you can see, there are a lot of improvements that have been made here to the a7R series and the Mark III. And there's just a lot that is going on for the camera here. And of course, the improved ergonomics are huge. The thumbstick is very welcome, as are the improved feel of the dials. The new battery life is fantastic, you know, an improved battery, as is the two cards here that allow you to, for many people that, you know, might not consider a mirrorless body that only has one card, if they're doing professional work and would have fear of their work being lost, or, you know, not being able to get, you know, the finished product to a client. The addition of the two cards is a huge addition there, as are just, you know, the general implementation of a lot of other feature things into the build and the autofocus system itself. Now, there is still one, in my mind, kind of glaring omission in terms of the handling and the ergonomics of the camera, and one that frankly is quite surprising to me. And that comes down to the kind of half-hearted implementation of the touchscreen that continues to persist in Sony's mirrorless bodies like this. And it really, it really surprises me when I consider that going all the way back, you know, for example, with Canon that I'm familiar with, back on the 70D, we had an implementation of a very good touchscreen that was very responsive and had all kinds of functionality there, you know, touch to focus, it, you know, you could navigate through all the menus more quickly using it. And we have seen that carry on into really the cheapest of Canon's DSLRs. I recently had a look at the Nikon D850, and while I didn't like its touchscreen quite as good as Canon's, it's very, very close. And so this a7R3 being such a technological powerhouse and having a touchscreen that only works for a very few bits of functionality and not at all for menu navigation and some other functionality, it just leaves me, you know, kind of perplexed, because certainly this has to be something that is within Sony's wheelhouse, something that they are very capable of accomplishing. So I'm not quite sure why we're still getting this half-hearted implementation, but that's probably my single greatest criticism of the handling and the ergonomics of the camera itself. Yeah, the menu system could be further improved and tweaked, but one thing I do applaud Sony for is the fact that, you know, there's a lot of ways of customizing your menu options and getting some of those hidden features. They're not hidden features so much as they're just kind of get buried in the menu system. But you have the ability to create your custom menu and kind of move some of those things to the foreground. And so, I mean, a lot of that I think is workable. And so I think that really it's the implementation of the touchscreen is the single biggest thing that I'm kind of concerned about or would like to see improved. If you'll stay tuned, I will be continuing to cover the camera. I'll be looking at a lot of different aspects of its functionality. We'll be looking at its image quality, you know, resolution, dynamic range, you know, ISO performance. I'll be taking a closer look at the autofocus system, and of course, as a part of that, also reviewing this new FE 24-105 f4 OSS lens that is a very, very nice match to the Sony a7R3 if you're looking for kind of a general purpose lens. And so we'll be looking at all of that together, and so stay tuned. If you look in the description down below, you can find I've got an image gallery while I'm adding images to, also images, you know, from the 24-105 lens, but along with that, a lot of other different lenses adapted to use for that. Even some of the APS-C lenses that I have that I'm, you know, utilizing on this body because it has a very effective crop mode that allows you to continue to utilize your glass there. And so that's a great addition as well. So stay tuned here, and of course, if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button. Thanks for watching today. Have a great day.